what muscle group or muscle groups do people complain about the most, saying, it's so hard to grow this particular muscle group?
Certainly calves.
All right. I would say the same thing. So isn't it interesting that maybe we have one weird trick for massive calf growth? Not really, but I'm talking about a study that was published recently from Warnicki and colleagues. The title is Influence of Long-Lasting Static Stretching on Maximal Strength, Muscle Thickness, and Flexibility. And for this segment, I'm only going to be talking about the muscle thickness bit. I think most people realize that stretching a muscle improves flexibility over time. Not really worth getting into. But the hypertrophy findings were pretty interesting. And we posted about this study on the Stronger by Science Instagram a couple weeks ago. Check out the Instagram if you haven't already. And the post got a lot of engagement and also a lot of questions, suggesting that I think some people didn't fully understand why we were talking about this study in the first place. So I wanted to do this segment for the podcast, both just to talk through the study and the results of the study more, but also I think it's a very useful study for helping us learn more about the process of accruing scientific knowledge over time, because studies don't just exist in a vacuum, and I think most consumers of information are interested in science for the purpose of giving answers of how should I train to maximize gains. But generally there's a fairly long process getting you to that point of trying to figure out not just what works best, but why it works better than other alternatives, like understanding mechanisms, which can then be used to guide future research to actually optimize training.
So reading between the lines, were people basically saying like this has low ecological validity, like it's not directly applicable?
Well, they were basically saying like, resistance training has to be more effective than stretching for calf growth. So like, why should I care in the first place?
Okay. Yeah.
Let's kind of trace the history that brings us to this study, to discuss why it's important. So, just as background, we've known for a long time that training through a full range of motion tends to cause more muscle growth than training through a partial range of motion. The classic study that people tend to cite to support this point is by Bloomquist and colleagues. But there have been plenty more studies that have been published in the intervening years. The Bloomquist study was from either 2011 or 2013, I believe. And in that study, they compared the effects of basically quarter squats, so squatting to about 60 degrees of knee flexion, versus parallel squats, so squatting to about 120 degrees of knee flexion. So you can see, if you're watching this on YouTube, what those ranges of motion looked like in the graphic that we're going to put on screen.
Cool image too. It looks like the person's wearing like one of those Spider-Man suits.
It is. Yeah, it looks like a skeleton in a mocap suit.
Yeah.
So high tech and spooky.
Cool.
Subjects trained through these two different ranges of motion for 12 weeks following the same training program. And basically they found that the group doing parallel squats experienced way more quad growth than the group doing shallow squats. And also, if you're watching on YouTube, we'll flash these results up here. But, for the most part, they measured quadriceps cross-sectional area. So just cross-sectional area of all of the muscle mass on the front of the thigh at 6 different points. So some more proximal points closer to the hip, down to more distal points closer to the knee. And what you saw was at basically all points, the deep squat group experienced increases in muscle cross-sectional area of like 4 to 7% in that pretty tight range. The shallow squat group did see some pretty decent hypertrophy at just the more proximal regions, so closer to the hip. But then for the distal regions, they saw no changes in quad size or even slight decreases. So overall, the deep squat group just saw way better quad gains than the shallow squat group. However, with a type of study like that, it's difficult to isolate variables because you could say, oh, hey, maybe the difference we're seeing here is due to the fact that the total range of motion was different. So the deep squat group was training through twice as much total knee flexion as the shallow squat group. Or you could say it's because the muscle links being trained were different. So not only was the total range of motion different, but the deep squat group, as they were going down, they were training the quads at longer total muscle lengths than the shallow squat group. So is it the muscle lengths that matter, or is it the total range of motion? It's hard to say just from the Bloomquist study and from probably the first half dozen studies that were looking at this question. So more recently, there have been a few studies that help disambiguate this a little bit further. So I'm going to talk about a study from Pedrosa and colleagues that will be linked in the show notes. But there have been some studies illustrating a similar point by Sato and colleagues and Mayo and colleagues, Maeo, I believe. But yeah, the study by Pedrosa was the first that I think really helps disambiguate that effect. Is it the muscle links being trained, or is it the total range of motion? So in the study by Pedrosa, there were 5 groups. One of the groups, and all of them were training knee extensions over 12 weeks. One of the groups trained through a full range of motion, which they defined as from 100 degrees of knee flexion to 30 degrees of knee flexion. So they basically had a custom-built knee extension machine rigged up where subjects didn't lock out all the way at the top. I think to kind of maintain muscle tension in all of the groups, not totally sure. But basically 100 to 30 degrees of knee flexion was full range of motion in this group. Then they had an initial range of motion group, which only trained from 100 to 65 degrees of knee flexion. So only training at relatively long muscle lengths. So not doing the top part of the range of motion. Then they had a final range of motion group, which only trained from 65 to 30 degrees of knee flexion. So same total range of motion as the initial range of motion group, 35 degrees of total knee flexion range of motion. But they were only training at short muscle lengths. Then there was a varied range of motion group where essentially they would do half of their training with partials at long muscle lengths and half of their training with partials at short muscle lengths, and a control group. And there were a lot of outcomes in this study. So there were 5 groups. They looked at 2 different muscles, both the vastus lateralis and rectus femoris. And they also assessed muscle cross-sectional area at 4 different points along the thighs. So, there are, somewhere around 120 discrete comparisons you could make in this study. But overall, the trend was pretty clear. All of the groups that trained at long muscle lengths, so the initial range of motion group, the varied range of motion group, and the full range of motion group, all experienced more quad growth than the final range of motion group that was only training at short muscle lengths, and they all did better than the control group, which is what you should expect. But this strongly suggests that the important factor with full range of motion outperforming partial range of motion isn't the range of motion per se. It's the fact that when compared to kind of the traditional approach of partial range of motion training, full range of motion training involves training at long muscle lengths, and that seems to be the important part. Because when you do partial range of motion training at long muscle lengths, that seems to be just as effective for hypertrophy as full range of motion training. Or if anything, maybe slightly more so. That's somewhat ambiguous. But at minimum, it seems like partial range of motion training at long muscle lengths is at least as effective as full range of motion training, which suggests range of motion per se doesn't matter all that much, but there's something important about training at long muscle lengths for promoting hypertrophy. So then the next question is basically why? Why is that so much more effective? And now we're getting closer to where the calf stretching study comes in. So a hypothesis that's been put forth to potentially explain why training at long muscle lengths is particularly effective for hypertrophy is the concept of stretch-mediated hypertrophy, which is essentially the idea that a active contractile stimulus, when also paired with a stretch stimulus, leads to more hypertrophy, better intramuscular signaling that would lead downstream to hypertrophy than just that active contractile stimulus. So that's basically the idea of stretch-mediated hypertrophy. And we've I think reached a point in some segments of the fitness industry where that's already accepted as fact. Like partial range of motion at long muscle lengths is really effective for hypertrophy, and full range of motion training is really effective for hypertrophy because of stretch-mediated hypertrophy, and we know that's the mechanism driving it. The thing is, we're not there yet. That is still a hypothesis that hasn't been fully proven, and the evidentiary basis for it, like there's certainly a theoretical argument you can make for it. If you wanted to make an argument about total tension on the muscle, presupposing that all hypertrophy just comes down to mechanical tension, and you look at maybe increases in passive tension as muscle lengths increase, and you say, oh, well, the stretch-mediated hypertrophy, that's because at long muscle lengths, you can put more total tension on the muscle, bigger hypertrophy stimulus. That is certainly a logical train of thought, but if you are interested in approaching this from an empirical perspective, like every discrete step in that train of logic, it hasn't been fully proven and elucidated yet. So currently, stretch-mediated hypertrophy is just a hypothesis, and it was a hypothesis on somewhat tenuous ground from my perspective. And the reason for that is most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, when you have a stimulus you know is effective for a particular outcome, so in this case, resistance training, active muscular contractile tension, we know that's effective for hypertrophy. If you do something else to augment that, to make it even more effective, generally the thing you're augmenting it with is also, at least to some extent, effective for hypertrophy in its own right. So a good analogy here would be protein intake. So you can't just force feed protein and get huge without resistance training. But we also know that independent of resistance training, protein intake does do a lot of nice things related to muscle protein balance. So, without a resistance training stimulus, if you eat more protein, you might lose muscle a little bit slower without a training stimulus. I'm comparing like kind of normal to super low protein intakes there. We know that mechanistically, consuming enough leucine in a meal will trigger muscle protein synthesis. Like there are a lot of those little variables like that where you can look at protein in isolation and be like, oh, this should do some nice things for muscle itself. So then when you pair adequate protein intake with a resistance training stimulus, that protein augments the resistance training response to give you better results than you would see otherwise. And so that's what you tend to see for things that might augment training responses. And the thing with stretching is there wasn't great evidence that it did independently do much for hypertrophy outcomes, at least in humans and with any sort of reasonable stimulus. So there were some chronic stretch studies in birds and cats and rodents back in the 80s and 90s, which basically found like if you put birds' wings under a weighted stretch for weeks at a time, it caused ridiculous amounts of hypertrophy and muscle hyperplasia. But like one, we're not birds, and two, that hadn't been independently observed in humans. And so if you want evidence, like indirect evidence for the concept of stretch-mediated hypertrophy, it sure would be nice to have human evidence showing that stretching itself posed a hypertrophy stimulus to the muscle. And there had been some prior suggestions that stretching per se could result in hypertrophy. So the study there that people would most commonly cite was by Simpson and colleagues, published, I think, in like 2015, 2016, where subjects had one leg that they stretched for 6 weeks, one leg that they didn't stretch for 6 weeks. And the stretch was a loaded calf stretch on a leg press machine that they would hold for 3 minutes, 5 days per week. So 3 minutes per day, 5 days per week for 6 weeks, loaded calf stretching. And that study did report that that stretching intervention led to hypertrophy. But we'll again, if you're watching this on YouTube, we'll flash the results up on the screen comparing the stretched and non-stretched legs. And really, it's not a slam dunk case. So the difference in calf thickness in the stretched and unstretched legs was a little bit less than 1 centimeter at baseline, and was ever so slightly more than 1 centimeter after the 6-week intervention, which the authors reported was a statistically significant result, P of 0.04, barely significant. It was the type of thing where, depending on your perspective, you could look at the study and be like, okay, this is some amount of confirmation that stretching is an independent hypertrophy stimulus. But if you wanted to be more skeptical, you could look at it and be like, okay, like I want to see more. Like this isn't super convincing stuff.
Quick interjection here.
Yeah.
To prove that I'm paying attention, you said a difference of 1 centimeter. Should that be a millimeter?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
0.1 centimeter.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, my bad. So yeah, it was essentially there was a little bit of prior evidence that a stretching intervention might lead to hypertrophy in humans, but it was I personally wanted to see more.
Right.
So the study I'm talking about here from Warnicki was what I would term a proof of concept study. So essentially with a proof of concept study, what you're trying to do is you think that an effect exists and you try to stack the deck in your favor to greatly increase the odds of you actually observing that effect. So a great example of kind of a whole area of research where there are a lot of proof of concept studies is studies that are interested in looking at different recovery modalities. And the way those studies tend to work is they put people through a muscle damage protocol that far exceeds anything anyone would ever do in practice. So, it might involve 75 maximal eccentric reps for a particular muscle group, which, if you've never done that before, that's, I think, almost an Eighth Amendment violation. Like it's rough. You're going to be fucked up from that. But, it's causing so much soreness, so much muscle damage that if whatever recovery modality you're interested in, if it will improve recovery, that is the type of situation where there's so much to recover from that you will be able to observe that effect. If you just kind of put people through a more quote unquote normal resistance training stimulus where people would just recover in 48 hours just fine anyways, even if the thing you're studying was very effective, you might not be able to observe that effect because you hadn't adequately stacked the deck in your favor. So I would call the Warnicki study a proof of concept study for the potential impact of stretching on hypertrophy. So the training intervention was more intense and longer lasting than I think most people would do on their own. So it was also a 6-week intervention like the Simpson study. It involved daily stretching lasting for 1 hour a day. Much like the Simpson study, subjects had one leg that was stretched, one leg that was unstretched. So each subject served as their own control. And essentially, there was a calf stretching orthosis, an orthotic device that you would put your foot in. And there were basically straps that you could pull to pull your toes up, pull your ankle into dorsiflexion. That's right?
Yeah.
I always forget dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. So yeah, you could pull your toes up to pull your ankle into dorsiflexion and essentially lock it in for an hour. And subjects were instructed on a 1 to 10 pain scale to stretch to the point of an 8. And I doubt they actually got there. because like if 10 is the most severe pain a human could be in, an 8 is probably like a broken bone. And I don't think they were actually stretching to that intensity. It was probably more like a 6, I would guess. But anyway, put yourself in a pretty uncomfortable calf stretch and hold it for a full hour. And do that every day for 6 weeks. Which, like I said, in a proof of concept study, that's more stretching than I think most people do for a particular muscle group. But, this is the type of study where if stretching can cause an independent hypertrophy response, this is the type of study where we would see it. And if we do see hypertrophy in a study like that, that confirms that a stretch stimulus might be an independent hypertrophy stimulus, which would help make more sense for why stretch-mediated hypertrophy might be a thing. Like it helps put that concept on firmer theoretical and evidentiary footing. And essentially that's what they found. So over those 6 weeks of stretching, the stretch legs experienced an increase in calf muscle thickness of about 15%. So that's a pretty notable increase compared to just 2% in the control legs. And also there was a good population used for this study. So they weren't completely untrained subjects. They were, quote, athletically active, having performed 2 or more training sessions per week in a gym or a team sport continuously for the previous 6 months. So, once again, it's not like the type of thing where with completely untrained folks, anything might be a hypertrophy stimulus. Like we're seeing calf growth just from stretching in folks who are at least like recreationally trained. So overall, I think this is pretty promising. Like I said, the main takeaway of this study, I think, is that it puts the idea of stretch-mediated hypertrophy on firmer theoretical and conceptual footing. And like I said, kind of in tracing the progress of science in this area over time, we started with the observation that full range of motion training led to more growth than partial range of motion training. The next question is, why is that? Is it total range of motion, or is it the range of motion being trained? Then more recently, we had studies saying, hey, it's probably the range of motion being trained. The fact that you're training through long muscle links, that seems to be more important than total range of motion per se. And then the next question is, well, why is training at long muscle links particularly effective? Might it be this idea of stretch-mediated hypertrophy? Well, if it is, it sure would be nice to see that stretching per se was an independent hypertrophy stimulus, which would help it make sense for why it might augment regular resistance training induced hypertrophy. So essentially, that's where we're at now. And then the next question is, what can we do with that? Can we use this information to make kind of normal resistance training interventions more effective? And it could be that we're a few years away from a breakthrough where we find out, hey, maybe full range of motion training is, certainly effective, but maybe partial range of motion training at long muscle links is even more effective. So, maybe the bros were right. The idea of constant tension training, not locking out your reps, that they may have been onto something. Like that may lead to more growth than just kind of standard full range of motion training. We have yet to see and fully confirm that, but that's sort of the next steps to take after a study like this. And one thing I will note is even though I would term this a proof of concept study, the type of thing where most people probably wouldn't do themselves, you could actually do this. So if you're really struggling with calf growth and maybe you're insecure about your small calves, or if you just want to maybe do Omar Isuf a solid, send this to him. This is the type of thing where you could actually implement this intervention. So they were just stretching one calf. You could do this with both. Just get some orthoses. And if you're sitting for an hour a day at work, playing video games, watching TV, you could just put your foot in that orthosis, get it in a stretch, and just chill out for an hour. I don't know how many people will want to do that, but this is theoretically a practical intervention someone could try to boost their calf growth. But for the most part, it is mainly a proof of concept study. So yeah, like that's mostly what I wanted to talk about. The point that I wanted to make clear is that by talking about this study on the podcast, posting about it on Instagram, I'm certainly not saying that stretching is more effective than lifting for muscle growth. And I'm not saying that you should try, just stop training your calves and only stretch them to promote muscle growth. That's certainly not what they're saying. This is more about trying to figure out why something works. And in this case, trying to figure out precisely why full range of motion training tends to be more effective than short muscle length partials, why partials at long muscle lengths seem to be particularly effective for muscle growth, whether the whole concept of stretch-mediated hypertrophy holds water in the first place. It very well could be that training at longer muscle lengths does lead to more hypertrophy due to some mechanism other than the stretch stimulus. Like, that's certainly still on the table. So this study helps confirm that the stretch stimulus very well could be augmenting the normal kind of resistance training hypertrophy response. And also I'll note that this is also the type of study that could potentially be useful for clinical populations. So one of the issues if someone, say, comes down with a really bad disease, gets hurt really bad, and they're on bed rest for a few weeks, one of the issues you run into with recovery there is if you're on bed rest and you can't move around at all, people just hemorrhage muscle and strength to the tune of losing strength at a clip of about 1% per day and muscle size at about 0.5% per day. So, if you're on bed rest for a month, you're in rough shape when you come back. And so just for getting back up and reconditioning yourself just for day-to-day life, like that can cause issues, like just the muscle and strength loss. And so if it could be that just intensely stretching a muscle for an hour a day, if that's effective, not even as a hypertrophy stimulus, but just for maintenance of muscle mass in those sorts of situations, it could be an efficacious intervention that people could do in situations where they can't resistance train. So it's also useful from that perspective. But yeah, for the most part, I wanted to talk about this to mainly just trace the story of scientific discovery, because most people really do just want to be told, okay, well, that's cool and all, but like, how do I train to get fucking huge and strong and jacked? But ultimately, this is the stuff leading to that stuff. There's almost always this process of progressive discovery. You make an observation, you try to explain that observation, and then the next answer leads to another set of questions. And it is that incremental process. And since range of motion and the concept of stretch-mediated hypertrophy are, I think, kind of hot in the fitness industry right now, I think I thought it was worth kind of taking a step back and tracing how we got here and how you might go about answering questions to more fully elucidate why these things seem to work.
Yeah, this brought up a lot of flashbacks for me. Mm-hmm. The worst feedback, the most criticism I've ever gotten for an Instagram post mm-hmm. was also a kind of proof of concept study. Mm-hmm. And I swore that day, if I ever post again about a proof of concept study, I'm going to have a disclaimer at the beginning, middle, and end of the post. Because I think I caught a lot of that. Yeah, it was like a caffeine post, and people mm-hmm. were like, Eric, you are the stupidest person I've ever met. Who would take 9 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine? And it's like, well, if you want to see how caffeine works, that's one way to do it.
Yeah.
And it's the same kind of thing with this. Like, the utility extends far beyond the experimental design, just from the proof of concept. Mm-hmm. But yeah, if you want to see, hey, can stretching a calf grow it? Like, yeah, throw them in the boot for an hour and see what happens.
Yeah.
So it's very helpful to see why things like this are useful, even if you're not saying, hey, go home and replicate this experimental protocol in its entirety.
Absolutely.